Meeting room. Just wait for the attendants to pop in. Hey everyone, we're just waiting for a few more people to turn up, and then we'll start kicking off shortly. The number seems to be fairly stable now. Cool. So hey everyone, welcome to Winter Navigation. Pretty apt at the moment, just as the temperatures are dipping and the snow on top of the Scottish mountains and on top of some of the Welsh mountains as well. So it's perfect time to brush up on navigation skills for the winter time. I'm Brad, and I'm going to be doing the sort of housekeeping bits today. And this is Kath as well. She's going to be doing most of the presentation. So I'll hand you over to her.
Hi, so I'm Kath, and I'm one of the senior instructors at Brennan. And I'm a winter mountaineering and climbing instructor. That means that I've got a qualification that allows me to take people winter climbing and mountaineering. And I'm also an international mountain leader, so I can take people out sort of internationally on things that aren't glaciated. So a little bit about myself and my sort of winter experience. I spent a lot of winters up in Scotland. Probably like the last 16 or so winters up in Scotland, teaching people and doing loads of climbing for myself and having a nice time. And I think it's the time of year I look forward to the most. And navigation that I'm going to talk about this evening is one of the key things for winter. Like if you're not sure quite how to navigate and look after yourself to get off a route or a walk when the conditions are sort of harder, then it can be pretty tricky to get yourself safely back to the car. So I guess those years of going winter climbing for myself and winter walking and Munro bagging, and combined with those years of working and teaching people these skills, mean that hopefully I should be a pretty good navigator. Yet to get lost in recent years, but had many epics in early years, which I might talk about a little bit. So that's a bit about me. Brad's going to tell you a little bit about himself, and Brad's going to be sort of looking after Q&A, so he will fill you in on that now.
Hey everyone, I'm Brad. I've lived in North Wales for about the last 10 years, and then I'd sort of do the pilgrimage to Scotland most winters as well for the last sort of 5 or so years, and lived up there for about 2-3 months throughout the winter, going climbing for myself, but also working towards the winter mountaineering and climbing instructor. So I'm going to do my assessment this year for that. Spent lots of time in sort of snowy and whiteout conditions out in the mountains, and having some of these skills, I think when I started out would have been really, really useful, I think, having less epics. So tonight I'm in charge of the sort of Q&A side of things. So I think loads of you have found the chat function on here. So that's amazing. So if you've got any questions at any point throughout the presentation, either use the chat function or the Q&A function, and we'll answer them in one of 3 ways, either through I'll ask Kath the questions if it fits into the presentation, or I might just type a response back so everyone can see that on the chat function, or we might just save them for later in the presentation or towards the end if that seems to work better. You're obviously all muted at the moment, so you can't talk, but if you wanted to ask a question that way, you can also do that. There's been a question already about whether this is being recorded. This is being recorded, and I'm not sure if it's going to go up on YouTube or not, but we'll definitely send out a link to everyone towards the start of next week. So maybe Monday or Tuesday next week, we'll send out a link to everyone so you can see the recording. We'll aim to wrap this thing. So we'll see how long the Q&A goes on, but we'll aim to wrap this webinar up by about 9 o'clock. So we can do that. We can't see all of you lot either. So there's a question, can you see us? No, we can't see any of you. You can just see us. So it can be a bit one-dimensional, this. So keep asking lots of questions on that chat, and we'll try and have as much interaction through there as we can. Sound good?
Brilliant. Thanks, Brad. So yeah, it is a bit strange when you can't see your audience. So apologies if it seems a bit weird sometimes. It's just very odd when you can't see your audience's responses, but the Q&A sort of helps with that, and I'm sure Brad will jump in with any relevant questions when required. So yeah, let's get started. I think a good place to start is comparing summer with winter, and I'm sure all of you have spent loads of time out in the hills in the summer, and even when the visibility is poor in the summer, there's often features on the ground that you can use to locate yourself and to work out where you are. If you look at the two pictures here, we've got Cohenschnechter and the Cairngorms in the summer, really visible, eroded paths, really easy to see the edge of the corrie rim. And in the winter, the paths aren't there, and the edge of the corrie rim has got a cornice. So cornice is where the wind has blown snow over the edge, over the steepening, and created a bit of an overhang of snow. So they're quite hazardous. I'll talk a little bit more about them later on in the presentation, but there's a big difference. Just from those photos, you can see a difference in terms of the features available between summer and winter. The other thing that happens in winter is that steep paths can actually become sort of grade 1 ground, where you might end up needing to be front pointing. So because that snow blows in over the top, it just creates steeper ground than the map might illustrate with the contours. So you need to just bear that in mind when you're going up steeper slopes, that they can actually be steeper than you think they might be. Your navigational legs tend to be longer. You're walking on a bearing a lot and pacing and timing. You could be pacing up to 800 meters, maybe 900, maybe a kilometer. Whereas in the summer, often there's a feature, whether that's like a small lake or a cairn or something like that. There's often a feature in the summer that you can navigate to that's less than a kilometer away. Reading the terrain is far more important in the winter. So you're taking into account changes in the slope angle. So where an angle might relax a bit and become less steep, or where it steepens up a bit. And the slope aspect, which direction a particular slope faces, is really important in the winter. Can be great for relocation, but it's also something that you need knowledge of to make sure that you don't get avalanched by going onto the wrong slope aspect. And of course, you're going to have lots of layers on. It's often really windy in the winter, so there's lots more faff in terms of your equipment. So I'm going to start with equipment, and I'm going to start with maps. And I think maps are an important thing to think about, both in summer and winter. Which is the most appropriate map for where you're going? And for me, there are 3 different scales that I'll regularly use, and different types of map that I'll regularly use as well. So the obvious one's the Ordnance Survey, and they come in a 1 to 50 and 1 to 25,000. And they're great maps. The 1 to 25,000 are brilliant in the summer because they're full of detail. As I said before, lots of this detail is covered in the winter and with snow. And so sometimes that extra detail detracts from what you're trying to do in the winter, navigating to points that are going to be more obvious. So I tend not to use a Ordnance Survey 1 to 25 in the winter, but I will often use a Harvey's 1 to 25,000 in the winter. And the Harvey's maps tend to show crags with just solid black lines, and they're sort of easier to see what's going on. They're a bit clearer. They've been adapted for walkers rather than being just a survey of the land. And Harvey's 1 to 25,000 might be my map of choice for somewhere like Skye or up in Torridon, where the ground's quite steep, and the same in Glencoe. So they're the sort of regions where I might choose that type of map. The BMC, in conjunction with Harvey's, make a load of really good maps for popular walking areas. They've got loads of really great information on the back of them, in addition to being a map, and they come in a 1 to 40,000 scale. So for example, the Lake District, if you go for 1 to 25,000 maps to cover the lakes, you need 4. If you go for the BMC one, you need 1. So your decision over maps has to link to the sort of terrain and the information that you're wanting to get from the map for the purpose of that particular day. So I quite often use a 1 to 50,000 OS in the Cairngorms, perhaps a 1 to 40 in the Mamors, and a 1 to 25 where it's much steeper. So that comes through experience, making that choice and talking to people about the sort of terrain you're going to visit, really. I think it's worth making sure that in the summer you're well practiced at navigating on a variety of scales of map, and then it just is second nature in winter, and you'll really quickly pick up on which might be the best map for where you're visiting. So that's a bit about maps and scales and types of map. The other thing is how we're going to carry this map. You've got big gloves on, you might be wearing goggles. So all of these things are a factor when you're choosing a map. I like to cut my maps down and put them in a waterproof case, because I find waterproof case is quite grippy. It's easier to hold on to when I've got a gloved hand. So quite often I'll get some of the Ortlieb cases in an A5 size, and then I'll just cut my maps down, fold them, put them in. I can have one map on one side, another map on the other. So if I'm going on the Ben, for example, I might have a 1 to 40,000 on one side, and you can actually get a 1 to 12,000 scale map, and I'd have that on the other side, and then I can flip between the two maps depending on where I am and what the conditions are like in terms of visibility. Sometimes I'll cut down maps and laminate them, but what I tend to find happens then is that the maps are quite slippery when they're laminated, so I'm not such a fan of that, but it is a good way to keep your map waterproof and make them last for a long time. You've got to go out and have a go and see how it works for yourself, really. But the key thing is that you can get it into your chest pocket, and it's easy to get in and out, and you're not going to let go of it as you're doing that. So it's accessible at all times. And the other thing I'll do is I tend to keep a bigger map in my bag as an emergency backup. Quite often I find those 1 to 40,000 BMC maps really useful. It's in my bag. They're already laminated, they're waterproof maps, and I just fold it to the area that I'm going for the day, and then shove it down the back of the back system in the rucksack, so it's there if I lose my other map. So there's a bit about maps and map cases and carrying your map. The other vital piece of equipment is a compass, and the key things with compasses are that you've got a good Roma scale. So that's a scale that measures distance, and the Roma scale needs to work for the maps you're on. Most type 4 silver compasses, which is the one I'd recommend, now have a 1 to 25,000, a 1 to 40 and a 1 to 50,000 Roma scale on them. So it just makes measuring distance much simpler than trying to do the maths after converting millimeters into how many meters that would be on the ground. Having a big base plate, so you can see this picture in the top left-hand corner, managing to hold the compass in place with your thumb. That big base plate does that. And the next thing is making sure it's accessible. So again, I'll tie it into my zip on my chest pocket, so I can just get it in and out whenever I need to, and I'm not going to lose it or drop it. So it's attached to me. And the other thing that I do with my compass is I keep some pacing beads on the string. So after I've paced 100 meters, I can just slide one of those beads along, and that just helps me keep count. Because if I've got to do 800 or 900 meters of pacing, it's really easy to lose count of that. So having a good Roma, well, a selection of Roma scales is important. A good size base plate so you can hold the map on the compass to take a bearing with a gloved hand on. Making sure it's accessible and that it's attached to you are all key things in terms of your management of your compass. So I've tried to come up with some things you can practice at home. I know a lot of people are in lockdown at the moment, and it's tricky to get to the hills to practice. So things you can practice at home and things that are worth doing before you head out is practicing taking a bearing with your gloves on. So you can just sit at home in front of the TV with your gloves on and practice taking a bearing, making sure it's accurate. Practice taking your map in and out of your pocket with your gloves on, and using your pacing beads with gloves on. So you can just sit in front of the TV and practice, and that'll all mean that you're more confident and comfortable with operating stuff. And if you've got a few different pairs of gloves, practice with different pairs of gloves, and don't give up on the ones that it's really tricky in, because they're probably your warmest gloves. that you're going to want to be wearing when the weather's not very nice, probably when you're going to have to be navigating. So just get some practice in at home so you're prepped. Okay, so the next little sort of topic I'm going to cover is hazards, and your equipment and the way you manage that links into hazards. But the key things are that the days are a lot shorter in the winter. So you could be walking at the start of the day in the dark, hopefully planning your day so you're back before it gets dark, but you could end up having to walk in the dark. So you need to be able to manage that. You need to either be able to plan, we need to be able to plan the day so that it fits in with daylight hours, but also you need to be good at navigating in darkness so you can get yourself back down if you get caught out. So practice that during the autumn, perfect time of year now, with it being dark just after 4 o'clock means that you don't have to have a late night to practice some night nav. So shorter days are one hazard. Cornices, I talked about them. There's a picture of a cornice, a very pretty looking cornice in the top left-hand corner here. They form when the wind blows the snow over an edge, and they're pretty dangerous. They're very fragile. If you stand on them, they can collapse, and they can be quite big in Scotland. So they could be up to a couple of meters in some parts of Scotland. There's definitely big ones form on Ben Nevis and on Bray Reach and on Anach Moor. So you want to be staying away from them as well, as much as possible. So your navigation strategies need to incorporate ways of staying away from cornices so you don't fall through one. The other sort of obvious thing in the winter is a whiteout. So the snow on the ground and you're up in the cloud. Just imagine being inside a ping pong ball, and that's what a whiteout's like. It's really disorientating. It can be hard to tell which way's up, which way's down. It can make you feel a little bit motion sick. It's a weird sort of feeling, but just being in that whiteness can make you feel a bit weird. So you need to be able to deal with whiteouts. The winds can often be strong in the winter, and you need to be able to deal with that. You don't want your map blowing away or you getting blown off your bearing. And then the other thing is avalanches. So you don't want to end up on an avalanche prone slope. Will's going to talk more about avalanches over the next couple of webinars, but the key thing from the winter navigation is that we know how to navigate well enough to avoid the places where we think there might be avalanches. So a few other tips for the winter: conditions can change really quickly and visibility can change really quickly. So it's important that you've got a good idea of where you are most of the time. It doesn't work to take a bearing from an unknown point because you don't know where you're going from and to. And summer tactics like being in the lee of the wind don't work in the winter. It's where we'd like to be, but we can't be there because that's where the snow will collect and potentially cause avalanches. So we've got to have a little change of mindset in terms of our winter navigation. Often it's safest to actually be in the wind. So here's a little taster of what it's like to be up in the white room in the ping pong ball.
Better get the comps out then, don't we? Get that way down.
I apologise for the quality. It's quite an old film, but it gives a good flavour, I think, of what it can be like. It is just white, and the compass and map are super important. So if we think about some strategies, good visibility, pretty similar to summer, relating the map to the ground or the ground to the map, and staying clear of edges. So the top picture there, you can see where the edges are. The weather's beautiful. You can see a small cairn in the distance, and you could just walk around to that like you would on a summer's day. The bottom picture, you can see a corniced edge and the group is staying back from the edge. There's some rocks sticking through, so that tells them that they're on solid ground and not stood on top of anything. But essentially, we can use really similar tactics to the summer, but avoiding those hazards that I talked about. Medium visibility, I'd say this is when the clouds blowing in and out a bit like this picture. Could be hard to see 1 minute and really easy to see the next. Keeping your eyes open, seeing what's ahead is important. keeping tabs on what's going on in terms of the ground and collecting features or changes in terrain, ticking them off, and following handrails as well. So it might be that you're following a ridge line rather than going on a route where you've got lots of plateau navigation to do. So this slide here, the bottom, just got an example of something you might do where you might plan, if you know the visibility is not going to be great in the day, following a ridge up, and then you can follow the ridge on down sort of in a south easterly direction from the summit of Thurthall. And this picture here is actually on that ridge in that sort of medium visibility. So not good snow cover, but there's rocks showing through. So you've got sort of definition within the snow there. Poor visibility. This is where you're going to be concentrating loads and you need a really tight strategy to avoid hazards. So you're estimating distance and you are dead reckoning and you're going to be concentrating a lot. So you might be walking on a bearing from point A to point B, but point B is not that well defined. And then from point B to point C to get to where you want to. And you're pacing that distance and you're using timing as a backup. So you're going to be really tight on your strategies when the visibility is really poor. And it's worth working as a team. There's no point in letting one person take charge of the nav. You need to work as a team, because if there's just one person in charge, it's really hard work on them. And if they sort of lose it, then your eggs are all in one basket. So try and work as a team and do the navigation together, so it's not all on one person's shoulders. So you need to develop your summer skills to be able to winterize them and be good in poor visibility. And this map at the bottom is the summit of the Ben, and this is that 1 to 12,000 scale that I talked about. And the 1 to 12,000 scale definitely gives you more detail. So the top of the Ben's the classic sort of black point when it comes to people having accidents in terms of not navigating effectively off the summit. And if you go too far on that 231 bearing off the summit, you get into steep ground and dangerous ground. But if you don't walk on that bearing, you end up at the top of Gardaloo Gully, perhaps walking through the cornice or Tower Gully. So being able to measure on that map that 150 meters, get the bearing accurate, pace that out, stop, and then take the next bearing of 282 and
sorry, Kath,
that distance.
There's been a few questions about what dead reckoning is. So
okay,
could you explain that a bit more, maybe in this scenario?
Yeah, so dead reckoning here, the fact that we're going to a particular, we're trying to get to a particular point on a bearing and pacing. So our pacing is never going to be 100% spot on, but we're getting as close as we can to that 150 meters by using a technique of counting our paces and walking on a bearing. That's to an undefined point. We then would do the same. So that dead reckoning is that sort of estimating your distance and your direction to get from one point to the other.
Cool.
So I've talked a lot about walking on a bearing and pacing, and it's worth visiting the kind of how do we know how far we've walked. Pacing is a pretty essential technique, and I think this is something you can practice in the summer. So you need to go somewhere where you know is 100 meters and you need to count your paces. And the best way to do that is to count every time you put down your right foot or every time you put down your left foot. Because if you count each footstep, you're going to have a pretty big number for 100 meters. So I start off and I count every time I put down the same foot. And for me, on the flat, in summer conditions, I do 70 paces to 100 meters. And I know how long my average stride length is. I sort of can visualize that. In the winter, I've got to vary that. What my paces are depends on the snow depth, the terrain, the steepness of the terrain, all of those sort of things. So what I do in the winter is I know my stride length's pretty similar when I'm on hard snow. So I'll use that same number. And then I've got a sort of visualization of what my normal stride length looks like. If I've gone about halfway for each step because of the depth of the snow, then I will do that 70 twice to get my 100 meters. If I'm doing 3 steps in where I'd normally do 1 for my normal stride length, then I might do that. Well, I have to do that 73 times to get my 100 meters. And that's why these pacing beads are really important, because if I've had to do 140 or 70 twice to get 100 meters, it's really easy to lose count. So just being able to slide a bead down once you've done that 100 meters is really sensible. The more you practice it, the better you're going to get at it. And obviously, if the terrain's really steep, the pacing's not going to work. You're going to be using the changes in the slope, like a break-in slope, rather than pacing to work out how far you've travelled. Does that make sense to folks? Are there any questions on that, Brad?
There was a few questions, but I think you've answered them. Do you have a view on using a counter clicker for pacing in winter? So I guess that what we pacing beads are for. So every time you do 100 meters, you slide a pacing bead, or a clicker if you wanted to use a clicker. But pacing beads are a bit more robust and sort of low streamlined than a counter clicker, I guess.
Yeah.
What else have we got? You walk it 3 times or more, then find the average.
When you're first trying to work out what your paces are for 100 meters, yeah, I would do it a few times. So I'd walk out, count my paces, walk back, count my paces, and then sort of work out from there roughly how many paces I do for that 100 meters. So it's definitely something to practice often in the summer, so that you've got a good idea of how your pacing works, and also so you can visualize that standard stride length that you're working your pacing number off.
Yeah. In terms of practicing, yes, get the average, but in terms of if I was just out navigating, I wouldn't average it out. I wouldn't just sort of walk back and forth 3 times. I'd just go do it once I know my pacings in that snow depth, snow type. Sorry, Kath.
Okay, so timing's another important method for measuring how far you've traveled. And as a walker, you sort of start to learn how fast you're walking, and that allows you to work out how long it's going to take you to get from A to B. So in the summer, you might look at a map and work out how long the whole day is going to take you. And then you might have certain parts of the day that you're splitting down and you're working out how long they're going to take. It can just be a really good way of working out how far you think you've traveled in terms of backing up your pacing. Obviously, when you're pacing and you're counting, you're going to be moving slower than if you're just walking normally. So you need to sort of be flexible and realistic on how fast you're going to move. And other things to have as a backup there is a timing card, so you're not doing loads of mental arithmetic. So timing card might tell you how long it's going to take you to walk 100 meters at 4 kilometers per hour. You need to go out and experiment in the summer so that you know how fast or slow you're moving when you're doing timings. Okay, and I generally tend to use timings as a backup to my pacing, but also I'll use it to work out how long a part of the day is likely to take as well. Are there any questions there, Brad?
What does use a break-in slope on the ascent mean, please?
So use of break-in slope. So if you're going up some steep ground, at some point you'll notice on the map that the contours become further apart because the angle of the terrain is shallower. And you'll also recognize that because your legs won't be aching as much and your heart rate will drop. So in the winter, it sounds a bit like some sort of dark art, but you're feeling the terrain more than perhaps you might do in the summer. You become much more aware of those breaks in slope. So for me, it's definitely a change in how hard I'm working once the angle decreases and it starts to flatten off. And I can use those points as tick off points, perhaps on a ridge line or at any point where I'm trying to work out how far I've traveled.
Cool. We've got a question about skiing here. We said skiing video earlier, Kath.
Yep.
How do you estimate distance travel when skiing?
That's really tricky. It's really tricky because your stride length is so much longer. So you need to go out and experiment with that, really. Yeah, when you're skiing uphill, obviously you're gliding on those skis, so that makes the sort of pacing side of things much more tricky. I tend to quite often use that sort of break-in slope type of thing more than pacing in that sort of terrain. So trying to recognize features that way. And when it comes to going on a bearing, actually just leapfrogging one another, because obviously you don't go in a straight line. You're going to be doing lots of turns when you're skiing. So just one person watching the other, getting to a point, going and communicating, say, yeah, we've got to there. And then the next person goes in front, and trying to keep yourself on a bearing that way. And just picking up on sort of subtle changes in the slope angle as well, to tick off how far you've traveled.
So we've got a few questions about pacing as well. So is pacing different in crampons, and is pacing different in steepness of slopes? And the answer to that would be yes, and probably both of them. There's different ways you can sort of estimate how far you've gone with the pacing, but I personally like to sort of visualize how far my pace is. So one step, so I count my left foot and to my right foot and then back to my left foot. So that's one pace, one stride from, and then I know how far that roughly looks like. Once I know how far that looks like, if I do 4 paces within that, I just count that as one. So it's not super accurate, but it does, again, you're sort of tying this pacing in with other things to make sure your strategy is very robust in there. So whether you're on a steep slope or whether you're wearing crampons or you're on rocky ground, whatever that is, you can make your pacing work for that type of terrain by using that technique. Okay. I don't own a watch other than like an old Casio thing. So do you have a watch you can recommend, Kath?
I have one I can't recommend.
No.
No, I have got a watch that is like a GPS watch, which I don't use very often. I've got really small wrists, and all these watches seem to be massive. And the one I've had most recently, the battery life on it's really poor. I think the best watch I've had is actually an altimeter watch that was made by Nike. And so it had a stopwatch, so I could do timing and I could get altitude. There are pros and cons over using an altimeter in Scotland. The weather can change so much, the pressure can change so much that they can be quite inaccurate sometimes. But in the Alps and the greater ranges, they're quite a useful tool. But on the whole, just a really good stopwatch is a really good thing to have. You know, something that's got big buttons that you can operate with gloves. So actually, this watch here on this picture, I think, is a Sunto Vector, and they have been pretty bomb-proof watches, altimeter watches, for probably a couple of decades, and they've got big buttons on them that makes them easy to operate in cold conditions with your gloves on. Having it on the outside as well, so you're not constantly pulling your sleeve up, or attaching it onto your rucksack strap is another a good top tip, so that you've got easy access.
There's a pacing on a bike. The pacing on a bike, just get a either get a GPS or get a what are they called? One of those things that measures your distance on your bike. The little magnetic thing. That's the best way on a bike. No point pacing it.
Yeah, and that's similar for skiing actually, Brad. So because you're moving so much faster, using some sort of GPS to measure your distance is a really good idea. Should we go on to bearings?
Yeah.
Cool. Right. So bearings, they're essential to be accurate in a whiteout. So you need to be able to walk on a bearing, sight little micro features in the snow. So it might be that you're just kicking the snow a little bit. So you've got some blobs of snow that you can use to sight to as you're walking on your bearing. You can look back behind you and take back bearings on your team, and you can work as a team for accuracy. So just have everyone lined up, make sure you're all walking on the same bearing, because it doesn't work if someone's on a slightly different bearing. So check that before you head off. All get in a line, check up on each other. When you're practicing, and even for real, it can be good to just have a GPS on to confirm and track you to make sure that you're walking on your bearing. And when the wind's really strong, it can be really hard to stick to that bearing. So, you know, just taking your time, going slowly, and being as accurate as you can. So that might mean you're taking more back bearings and you're working more as a team to be able to make that work. So pacings and bearings and timings, all essential tools for the winter, but the sort of different, there's technical names, I suppose, for different techniques we might use are dog legs and boxing are two of them. And a dog legs, just like in this picture here, it's what I described to get off the summit of the Ben on that 1 to 12,000 scale map. So we're taking a bearing from one defined point to another, but via an indefinite point. And it can be used to avoid hazards like edges and cornices, or you could use it to avoid a slope as well if you wanted to. And my top tip, I think this picture is really good, but actually if I was here navigating, I would go from point A to the 9. And I'd take that bearing and measure that distance. And then I would go from the 9 into the ridge line, taking a bearing and measuring the distance, because it's quite hard to be accurate and take the next bearing off that point that they've gone to, where the arrow and this little circular dot is. So where you can, if you can find something on the map that you can go to, it won't be a feature on the ground, but it's the point you can then use again to make sure that you're going from the correct place when you're taking your second bearing. So just to reiterate that, I'm going to go from A to the middle of the 9, probably would work well, and then onto the ridge line. The other technique is boxing. So it's an extension of the dog leg. And I like what they've done in this one. They've gone from A to the top of the R and then across and then back. So they've avoided that edge. You can do boxing to avoid big features or small features. And you're just measuring that distance. You're doing exactly the same as the dog leg, taking the bearing, measuring the distance, walking, stopping, taking the next bearing, measuring the distance, walking, stopping, and then the same again. So these are two techniques that I would practice in the summer and autumn to make sure that I'm feeling confident with using them. And you can practice these sort of things at home. So you can practice walking on a bearing. You could take a sight bearing on a tree in your garden. You could put a bag, like a dry bag or a pillowcase or something, whatever you've got, something that's not going to suffocate you ideally. Put that over your head and then make sure you can just see the compass and your feet, and then try and walk on the bearing and see if you can hit the tree. You could double this up practicing your pacing. So walk away from the tree, count the paces, look back at the tree, take the bearing, and then see if it's the same number of paces for you to get back to the tree. You can do boxing around a tree or a bush, or you could put a cone in your garden and box around that, or do a dog leg around it. You could perhaps go out to a local park to do this. It'd be good to do it in the dark as well, so you're super confident, and practice using your watch with gloves on as well. And it's worth, in addition to the 3 things I've noted, or 4 things I've noted there, doing it with goggles on. So yeah, these are all things you can practice at home before you go out, so that you're feeling confident in using your equipment and you're feeling confident in the techniques that you're going to be needing to use up in the wintry mountains. Any questions there, Brad?
A few questions about altimeters.
Yep.
About GPS altimeters rather than barometric altimeters, or how do you use an altimeter? So maybe just talk through altimeters a little bit.
Yeah, so a barometric altimeter, for those who don't know, uses the air pressure, the change in air pressure with height gain or with height loss, to calculate what altitude you're at. And you need to regularly sort of recalibrate those altimeters to make them accurate. And obviously if a weather system comes through and there's a big change of air pressure, then that has an impact on the accuracy of the compass. Whereas GPS ones use the GPS system to work out your altitude. And I think there are pros and cons to both. Sometimes the GPS one can be quite wildly out because you've not got enough satellites to make it accurate. And sometimes a barometric one can be wildly out because the air pressure's changed so much that it can't keep track of what's going on. So ideally, I think it's good. There are a lot of watches and GPSs now that have both. And if you can find one and afford one that's got both, then that's probably your best way to go with that.
Awesome.
Cool. So talked about dog legs and boxing, and they're very much techniques to use to get from one point to the next. Slope aspect is a technique that we use to relocate ourselves or to check that we're where we think we are. So if you've come off the top of a conical shaped mountain, then you might need to just check that you're going the right way. Perhaps you've just wandered off and you think, oh, these things aren't matching. You know, it was meant to go down steeply, but it hasn't. Where am I? So to take a slope aspect, you need to point your compass straight down the slope and take a bearing. And then when you bring it back to the map, you move the compass along the map until your direction of travel arrow is perpendicular to the contour lines. And then that will tell you which slope aspect you're on. So the person, number one, they've taken their bearing down the slope, and then that direction of travel arrow, which is extended out from the compass, is perpendicular to the contour lines. The same with number two. So you can see you get a different bearing, like 155 degrees on person number two to the bearing that person number one's got. So it will tell you which slope aspect you're on. It doesn't work so well if you're on the side of a mountain that's the same slope aspect, but it can be really useful as a relocation tool when you're on a sort of more conical shape, or perhaps you're on a broad spur and you want to work out which side of it you're on. This diagram here just shows that with a compass rather than a person. So that's something you can practice in the summer to sort of work out what slope aspect you are on. And that can help with relocating. You can then use other things around you to help yourself relocate other features, how far you think you've traveled, what the terrain's doing, what the contours are doing, and so on. Any more questions there, Brad?
There's been a few questions about magnetic variation as well. We're just saying at the moment we don't need to worry about magnetic variation because it's too small in the UK anyway to be of any worry. But the magnetic north is moving from the west to the east. So unlike a few years ago when we had to sort of make the variation from the compass would have pointed slightly west, so we need to make a variation to the east. We have to do it the other way shortly, but it's not just yet. It's going to be in a few years.
All the little rhymes won't work anymore, will they? Or they're like,
no, that's it. What you've been saying in here. There was another one. Someone just wrote, "West is best and east is least." Works anywhere in the world. So I guess you'd take,
yeah. Okay. So, any other questions in relation to bearings, timing, pacing, slope aspects, any of that stuff? Dog legs, boxing.
Yeah, it's a good point here. Do ice axes affect the needle of the compass?
Yes, thanks. That's something I forgot to mention. So yeah, when you're walking on your bearing, you want to be trying to keep your ice axe out of the way as much as possible. So if I'm on a plateau, I might just stick it down like the back of my rucksack, between my back and my rucksack, so it's easy to grab if I need it, but it's out of the way of my compass. And if I'm somewhere where I know the ground's a bit steeper and I want my axe in my hand, I try and hold the axe out to the side so it's not influencing the compass at all.
Yeah, so the walking poles, watches, mobile phones, anything metal, anything with a magnet in it will affect your compass. So keep the string of your compass nice and long and maybe tied to your, like a toggle on your jacket like that. So it's affixed to you, and then you can hold it right away from your body and it's not going to be affected by any of those those things.
It's worth noting as well that don't put your mobile phone in your pocket with your compass, because it will just reverse the polarity of it. So it'll point, the wrong end will point north. So you need to just make sure you're keeping your things like that away from that compass. So don't store your compass, your map, and your mobile phone in that same chest pocket. Ideally, have your phone away so it's not going to affect or damage the compass.
Yeah. There's also been quite a few questions on how to measure 100 meters for pacing, so you get it very accurate. Someone said about laying a walking pole down. There's sort of a lot of 1 meter length walking poles. I sometimes use a 50 meter climbing rope, so it's 50 meters. Lay that out on the ground, and you've got 50 meters. You can times it by 2, or fold it over again and roll that. Have you got any other ways you might you use, Kath, for
I think
100 meters?
if you had access to a running track, you could use the 100 meters, or sort of like sports pitches that are certain distances. Or if you're out in the mountains in the summer and you measure something, 2 distinct points that are 100 meters apart on, perhaps on the top. There's definitely some points on the top of the Glidders where there's like a knoll and then a cairn that are 100 meters apart, and then you can just practice pacing between them.
Yeah, and GPSs will work, but there will be a bit of variation in GPS. It won't be exactly 100 meters, because you will there's a bit of variation in where the GPS will plot you, depending on your GPS or your phone, whatever you're using for that. Motorway hard shoulder, I'd avoid that one, I think.
Okay, so earlier on I talked about some of the different hazards that we encounter in the winter, and I'm going to run through a few of them now. So avalanche risk. Will is going to talk about that in the next 2 webinars. But in terms of your navigation, you need to be ensuring that your strategy takes into account and avoids avalanche risk. So you can get timing cards that have a way to measure slope angle on them. And there's a slide with a picture of one of them coming up. But if you know that a slope is 30 degrees or more, then that's where avalanches are likely to happen. And if the wind's been blowing, as on this picture, from the west, then the snow's deposited on the east slope aspects. So it can be helpful to shade in the areas that you think are going to be avalanche prone. So you can get that information from the avalanche forecast. You could get that information from the weather forecast if you're in an area where there isn't an avalanche forecast, and you can highlight those slopes so that you can just avoid them. So this is the benefit to having a laminated map. You can get a marker pen and shade out the areas that you really don't want to visit, and then perhaps even just draw an arrow to remind yourself of where the wind's coming from on that map to help aid your decision making when you're out and about. I think that's the best way really to make sure you're avoiding avalanches, and then it's marked on your map, and then you can navigate around those danger areas. So this is just a good example here. We've got in green, we've got all the ridge lines, and in purple, we've shaded in where the snow might get deposited. And then you can highlight where the steeper slopes are as well. So it's a slope angle measurer. If you come on a Placer Brennan course, then you probably end up with one of these timing cards that you can also measure the slope angle for a 1:25 and a 1:50,000 map. And you can just line them up against the contours, and then that will show you where the 30-degree slopes are. So avoiding avalanche risk is identifying on the map where avalanches are likely to happen and making sure you don't walk there. Avoiding cornices can be a little bit trickier, and I'm just going to talk through a little bit of how you might use a rope to safeguard yourself to make sure you don't fall through a cornice. So if you're trying to approach an edge because you're wanting to get down a ridge line, in poor visibility, the best thing to do is often to rope up. So you're tying the rope around the waist of one person, about 10 meters back around the waist of the next person, 2 or 3 meters then between other members of the party. And you're going to all be walking forwards towards that edge with the person at the front, probably kicking and poking with their ice axe to see if they can see where the edge is and where that ridge line's going down. But should the cornice collapse or they go through it, then they're attached to a rope and they don't take the ride to the bottom. Okay, so that's a technique that's really sensible to use. Communication's key. You need to have a plan. You usually have to do this when the weather's bad and you can't see and it's hard to communicate. So you need to talk about what the plan is before you're 10 meters apart. And my sort of ideal scenario here is that the people who are on the land side, not approaching the edge, they're trying to keep the rope tight all the time. So if the person who's searching for the edge steps back towards them, they step back to keep that rope tight. Okay. The other thing you can do is you can tie some knots in the end of the rope closest to the person. So if they do go through, they can sort of hand over the knots and dig out with their ice axe. The downside to having a load of knots is it creates a load of friction that means it's much harder for the people on the top still to pull that person back out. So there are pros and cons. Hopefully you never need to use, hopefully you never drop through something to have to climb back out. You just manage to find the edge and successfully then chop out a little gap in the cornice to get down that ridge line that you've been searching for. But it's a really important technique to stop yourself from coming to harm. And it's very much like a navigational tool for the winter that we wouldn't even think about in the summer. So I'm going to show you a little clip of some people approaching an edge and you just can't see the edge actually. So here it goes. This guy, the guy at the front's just looking for the edge. They're actually following the edge along to try and find the ridge. You can just see there's no definition there. It's all white. And they're keeping the rope nice and tight. So those guys will have communicated beforehand so they know what to do. They know to walk backwards if the rope goes slack or to slowly walk forwards if the rope goes tight. And probably a lot of hand signals, so like thumbs up or a sort of come on over once the edge has been found and located and they know it's safe to proceed downwards. So that's a useful technique. That's something that's worth practicing on a day out when it's not something you're kind of trying to do for real, so that you can practice that communication and see how it feels, rather than having to do it for the first time in a whiteout when it's really windy and it's snowing loads in a full-on blizzard. So definitely a skill worth practicing. Again, you could practice that in your garden if you wanted to, and get the communication sort of going so you know how it feels to be tied to the rope. Any questions there, Brad?
I think you've answered this one. Can you use this handrail and edge, the rope technique to handrail and edge?
Yes, you can. Yeah, that's another really good use of that.
Yeah. And yeah, it's a really good point from Neil here. It says the rope-based techniques for approaching edge is good, but scary and needs practice and good communications.
Yeah,
definitely agree with that.
Yeah, it's pretty scary, the idea of dropping through a cornice that's like 2 meters hanging out. And I would be really selective over where I might use this technique. So my route planning will help to make sure that I've not got to use that technique in somewhere where there's potentially 2 meters of overhanging snow. I wouldn't even want to be trying to descend something where there's such a big cornice. Mm-hmm. So think in your route planning, some of it's about local knowledge and just getting information from other people to find out where are good access points, what are good journeys to follow, what are places that people regularly go. And also just thinking about how, if the wind's been blowing from the west for weeks, are those easterly aspects just going to be hugely corniced and places you really don't want to go? So you're not putting yourself at risk of trying to get through some horrendous cornice. This is just like an emergency technique when visibility is bad and there's not going to be a big cornice.
Yep,
Yeah.
So what kind of rope would you carry, Kath, if you were a hill walker rather than a climber, for this kind of technique?
Okay, I'd carry something fairly light. So probably you can buy these little confidence ropes from lots of outdoor shops. So one of them would be ideal. They're normally sort of 8.5 mil, which is quite thin, quite hard to hold on to. And I wouldn't be using that if I was climbing, but for this sort of technique, I think it works okay.
That's the diameter of the rope, 8.5 mil.
Yeah,
diameter.
8.5 mil diameter and about 25 to 30 meters of it.
Yeah. And if there's just two of you, would you be able to use that technique?
Yeah, you would, because you create friction. Friction would be created, which would, you've got friction, you've got a lot of traction with your crampons on, able to grip. And I think ideally you'd have the heavier person on the sort of back end and the lighter person on the front end looking for the edge. But the fact that you've got crampons on gives you a lot of extra traction. And again, as I said before, you're not going to go trying to do this technique somewhere where there's big overhanging cornices. Yeah, so I've used it when there's just been two of us to follow an edge to find the ridge line down, and it's fine. Yeah,
and that's a dynamic rope for the last question. And the people aren't wearing harnesses in that thing. You could use a harness, that'd be fine. But if you're just out walking, you just tie a big overhand in the rope and put that around your waist, which isn't very comfortable, but you're not aiming to weight that rope very much, so it's fine. There's quite a lot of questions on avalanches as well. So could you explain which side of the slope you need to be considering the wind with snow? So the wind blows from one side, that's the windward side. If it's blowing from the west, the snow gets picked up on the western side of the mountain, gets blown over the top and gets deposited on the lee side. That would be the eastern side. So if the wind is blowing from the west, then you wouldn't want to be on the east. And there's a more detailed, that's a very simplistic way of describing it. What I'd recommend is looking at maybe next week's webinars, sort of next week and the week after, because they'll explain this in much more detail. And we'll just stick with the navigation today, I think. Does that sound? Because otherwise it's just a lot of information, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that sounds good. I guess one way to think of it is, I'm sure most of you will have been to the beach on a windy day, and if the wind's blowing the sand across the beach, and you always get a big buildup of sand on the sheltered side of your windbreak, and it's a bit like that. So the snow gets picked up and blown, and then it drops down into the sheltered areas. So if the wind's blowing from the north, it'll get dropped on the southerly aspects. If it's blowing from the west, it'll get dropped on the easterly aspects. But we'll cover that in much more detail with diagrams that help to explain it as well. So come along for the next two webinars.
And there's one question here about why would you be looking for the edge? Surely you want to find safety away from the edge.
Why would you be looking for the edge? So sometimes you need to find the edge to find the ridge line that you're wanting to follow in descent. You might be looking for the top of a gully. So it might be that you've been climbing on Ben Nevis and you've got to the top of number 4 gully, which is a really common climber's descent off Ben Nevis, and you just want to get that rope on to approach the edge so you can see where it is, because the visibility is really bad. So it might be that you're going down a gully, and so that's a sort of easy gully, but that's a way of making sure you're keeping yourself safe to find that edge. Because you could see in that picture or that video, there's no definition between where the edge is and where the snow and ground is. So
you might not know that the edge is corniced, and it might be a safe slope, but you just want to move towards that edge really safely, because if it is corniced, then if you do step on it, that's not very good. Understatement. And then if you are roped up, it'll probably be all right. There's something there to save you, I guess.
Brilliant.
And how would we know if an edge is corniced, Kath? So by looking at a map, how would you know if an edge is possibly corniced?
So the only way you can know for sure is actually visually seeing it, or someone telling you it's corniced. The other way to work out whether it is corniced is to have been following the weather forecast and knowing which way the wind's been blowing from. And then if the wind has been blowing from the west, the eastern sides are likely to have cornices. and it's going to be above steeper ground. So if it's like gently rolling, there's less chance of the cornice being there than like where it's steeper ground. Yeah.
And just for the people who've asked what handrailing is, so handrailing is following a feature, like following along a feature. So if you're along a fence, so if you've got following a fence or directly with that fence, you'd be handrailing that fence. Or if you're walking down a stream, you'd be handrailing a stream, the same as you can do for an edge. You could just walk along the edge, and that, in navigation terms, you'd be called handrailing an edge.
Brilliant.
And if you're on your own, how would you find an edge, Kath? What if you?
Sorry, say that again.
What if you're on your own, and how would you find an edge if you're on your own?
Very cautiously. Yeah. Yeah, really super cautiously. I think if you're going to head out on your own in the winter, this question was asked last week actually about heading out on your own in the winter, and you need to be robust in looking after yourself and navigating and making good decisions about where you're going and what you're doing. So I guess in winter, there's a bigger risk to going out on your own than being in a team with other people. You're totally reliant on yourself and your ability to know where you are and know where that edge is. So there's not really a way to safeguard yourself approaching the edge when you're on your own. So I'd say it's better to go out when the conditions are good, and then you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, or snowballs as well as another way, but that's a bit of a scary way sometimes, seeing snowballs disappear off an edge. Or kicking snow in front of you maybe sometimes. Yeah. Are you going to talk about low vis relocation later on, Kath? Sorry, I can't remember.
No, we're not. No. Well, yeah, no, not particularly.
I think the best way at the moment is to have a GPS or some sort of technology to relocate in low vis.
Yeah.
Sort of the most robust way. There are other ways, but yeah, that's probably the easiest. What else we've got here? Cool. Yeah, carry on, Kath. We can.
Okay. So when you're climbing, you can be so absorbed in the next pitch that it's easy to not think about how you're going to get off the top. And on a burly day, it's definitely worth stopping before the final pitch and coming up with your strategy with your climbing partner. So getting the map out, making sure you might have put your map in your bag, your compass in your bag, so you're more comfortable when you're climbing. Get that out, get it back in your pocket, and work out your strategy for descent. Get any bearings, distances measured. So you're sort of ready to go. If it's really windy on the top, you just want to get out of there as soon as possible. You want to untie from the ropes, chuck them in your bag, and start walking. So have all that information ready. Make sure you both know the plan, and then you're good to go once you've topped out and you can get out of the gnarl as quickly as possible. I think something that's worth thinking about for a lot of places, sometimes the longer option, so it might not be your preferable option, but it might be your safer one. So you might top out on, I don't know, Green Gully, Combe Gully, something like that on the Ben. And the shortest option for descent is to go to number 4 Gully, but the weather's really unpleasant. You're in a total whiteout. Actually, taking a bearing and doing a dog leg to get yourself onto the tourist track and to go down that way might be the safer option than spending loads of time trying to find the top of number 4 Gully. So just think about that. Think about what your options are. Hopefully you'll plan that into the day before you head out on the climb. And maybe you don't get onto the climb you intended to do and you've ended up doing something else. This like little bit of time before your final pitch to sort of, it might be that you know you're going to need goggles, but you haven't needed them on the climb. So you can get your goggles on for the last pitch. You can get your navigation strategy sorted, perhaps have a quick bite to eat so you're energized and ready, and a drink and ready to go once you top out. So technology, we've talked a little bit about technology already. Brad just said just now, relocating, best way is a GPS, and I think he's right there. It can be pretty simple to get out an app like View Ranger or the Ordnance Survey app's really good. And get a grid reference. There are loads of grid reference apps available as well, so you can then transfer that back to your paper map. But a great way to get an accurate location. I would say it's always worth sort of double checking as much as you can with what the apps come up with on your map. So kind of using the history you've got of where you've traveled, how far you've traveled, and what features you've got around you. Are you on the right slope aspect for that to be accurate? So you can tie all those things together to get yourself a good location, and then work from there. Map and compass skills are really important because they'll make you robust on a day when the weather's really gnarly. I think to totally transfer to using a mobile phone for the winter is quite a big risk. I know quite a funny story of some folks who decided that they didn't want to take a map and compass because they thought the weather was going to be really good, and they went up on the Ben and they got to the top and the weather wasn't as good as they thought, and one phone got really cold and wasn't working, and the other one followed shortly after, and then they had to find their way down. So if they just had a map and compass with them, they would have been able to sort that out really easily, and they were fine and they got down and it was all good. But I think it's one of those stories that really highlights that you need the map and compass skills. That technology is brilliant, it's a really useful aid, can be great for tracking things, to check things, but having a map and compass is really important because batteries go flat, phones stop working. You really don't want to have to take your gloves off when it's really cold to move the phone around and to operate it. So use it, but make sure you can do the other stuff as well.
Have you got any recommendations for good GPSs or smartphones, Kath? What apps?
I like View Ranger and I like the OS app. And if you come on a Placid Brennan winter course, you'll get a month's free subscription to the OS app. So both of those are really good. And then in terms of GPS, I mean, Garmin make good GPS watches, Sunto make good GPS watches. So it's a case of working out what your budget is and looking at the features and seeing how that sort of matches in with what you're after.
Yeah, like you said earlier, the disadvantage of smartphones are the touch screen, especially in winter or wet conditions. The touch screen just goes really bad. So if you know you're going to get gnarly conditions a lot, then having some sort of button press or toggle GPS is actually really useful, even though it doesn't quite seem. But then the pixels on a smartphone are often a lot better, aren't they? The maps are a lot clearer depending on how much you spend on a GPS. And battery in the cold, trying to keep your phone as warm as possible, or having a battery pack in your bag to boost it.
It can be hard to operate as well, can't it? Your mobile phone when it's cold. Some gloves, some leather palm gloves will work really well, and others won't. And you can use your nose, but it's hard to be accurate with that. So, and I don't know if it works when your nose is cold. I haven't tried that. But just being mindful really that any of this technology, it's all got batteries and it can get cold and not work. Yeah. But that it's worth playing around with some of these things to see what you like and see what you think might back up the traditional map and compass. Yeah,
there's lots of apps out there. There's FatMap as well here. It's been recommended. That's really good. It also has a little function where you can shows you the avalanche terrain or the potential avalanche terrain on some days as well.
Yeah, FatMap's quite a good visual sort of 3D mapping system that works well for stuff. Right then, managing your expectations. So I think you need to manage your expectations a lot more in winter. I would say for every 5 days out, you might get one that's decent. But for every day out, you always learn something in the winter. So every day is worthwhile, but it's not uncommon to need to turn around, and it's worth just having an open mind each day. Some journeys need to be out and back because that's the safest thing to do avalanche wise. or it might be the easiest thing to do logistics wise, because it's so far to drive around and work out how you get back to the other side at the end of the day. So just manage your expectations. Don't push things too far too soon. Start off when the days are short with shorter days, and as your navigation and confidence increases, then you can start stretching things and challenging yourself a bit more. If your navigation skills aren't up to poor visibility, then don't go into the poor visibility. Go for a walk in the valley. Do something that you can safely do, that's not going to be terrifying for yourself. So gradually build up with all of this. Practice lots in the summer, and gradually sort of push the level of challenge as your level of confidence and experience and your ability improves. So I've given you a few things to practice that we think are things that you can easily practice at home at the moment. But practice in the summer in mellow conditions to become skillful to deal with the full-on days. You need to practice to become confident, and you need to keep practicing. So I can't just go to Scotland and be a confident navigator. I have to be navigating lots through the summer, and now through the autumn, I'll be practicing some of those key skills. So I'll be practicing walking on a bearing. I'll be practicing pacing whenever that opportunity arises. On days where I'm not going very far in the winter, I'll be practicing. So it's all about keeping that navigation ticking over. The skill of navigating can fade really quickly, so you just need to keep on top of it as much as you can. So useful books. I think the best book to recommend for sort of general winter stuff is the Winter Skills book by Andy Cunningham and Alan Fife. It's a brilliant book. It covers everything from movement to avalanches to what to do in an emergency, and navigation techniques as well. So that's a really good book that will be a good reference for all things winter and winter climbing as well.
Okay. So throughout the winter time, Plaza Brennan actually move up to Scotland, and they've got a base with that just outside of Glencoe in Ballachulish, and we run lots of these different courses. So you can see on the side there lots of different courses they're running this year. So the Scottish Winter Skills, so that's for your sort of first taste of Scottish walking. So introduction to put on crampons, axes, and then going on some amazing journeys around the sort of the mountains on the west coast. Then for the next step up, if you want to go for a bit more of an adventure, there's the Scottish Winter Mountaineering. That's gone sort of more mountaineering terrain, so slightly steeper terrains, potentially using a rope, often using a rope on that, and get into some slightly wilder places. So like Ledge Route on the Ben Nevis would be a classic example of that, or some other amazing stuff around Glencoe and the Ben Nevis area, Loch Arbour. And then as you move up, you can obviously move into sort of introduction to winter climbing. So if you're first time going out winter climbing, then come on that course. And then there's performance winter climbing course, which is sort of grade 4 or grade 5 winter climbing. And then also the Winter ML and WMIC Winter Mountaineering Climb Instructor trainings and assessments are based up there as well. So this is sort of completely separate from Glenmore Lodge, and it's Plaza Brennan move up there with their instructors and live up there for the winter time, basically. And we also do Welsh winter courses as well, where we make the best of the conditions. This is actually this is within walking distance of Plaza Brennan. This is the Shabod sort of Deir ridge up. Apologies for my Welsh pronunciation there, if anyone lives in Welsh. And then this is the ridge right at the back up to Shabod behind Plaza Brennan. I think Kath was last year. It looks amazing. It looks like you can ski the gully from the summit there. Incredible.
2019 it was.
2019. And these are either 2 or 5 day courses, and they're all inclusive. So, and again, it moves up in those stages. But there's not a climbing course for the Welsh things on there.
I guess the Welsh Winter Scrambles is the closest to a climbing course. So that runs on a 1-to-2 ratio. So if there were winter climbs possible in Wales, that would give you your best chance of getting on some. So if you were on that course, we would do sort of what suits you and what suits the conditions. That's kind of our closest to to a climbing course because winter climbing conditions are not particularly reliable in Wales, although they're amazing when they are here.
Of the Scottish courses, Kath, can you book on without accommodation? Is it non-residential as well? You know?
I'm not sure actually.
No.
Need to ask the bookings team.
Yeah, email info@pyb.co.uk and they'll give you an answer to that. We'll just answer a few more questions towards the end here, and then what else have we got? WinterML question: can you use a GPS on WinterML?
On your WinterML assessment, you
Yeah.
will be expected to navigate mostly with a map and compass, but also to demonstrate how you can use a GPS to aid your navigation. So that different providers and different assessors will do that in slightly different ways, but on the whole, there'll be a point during the assessment that you're asked to show how you can use a GPS to aid your navigation. Yeah.
Awesome. What course for the grade 1 to 3 climbers? So the grade 1 to 3 is probably mountaineering terrain. So the Welsh mountaineering or the Scottish mountaineering course would be great for 1 to 3.
Oh no, so that grade 1 to 3, go for an intro to winter climbing.
Sorry.
Yeah.
There you go. And I think managing the courses throughout lockdowns. Do you know what's? I think there's offering.
So the best place to get the full terms and conditions is on the website. And it'll just fill you in. If there are lockdowns and things, then there are options for refunds or switching courses. But the best thing for you to do is to read the terms and conditions on the website, so you get the full info, and then you're reassured about what you're signing up to.
Cool. And a question about glasses and changing reading glasses. I don't wear glasses. Any tips for glasses?
I don't either, but over the years I've seen quite a few people deal with this. Some people will zoom in on the map. So if you get some mapping software and print the map zoomed in so that you can see the detail better. So I know some people do that. Some people use contact lenses, and some people just seem to be really good at being able to cope with switching between glasses and not having glasses. Yeah. So there's a few ideas there. I think the thing that seems to be sort of that like works well for most people is that having a printed out, zoomed in version of the map, so that they can use that instead.
Yeah, and prescription goggles have also been mentioned a few times here. So I know my dad uses them, so that's pretty good. What else have we got? A few more. Types of harness you'd use for winter climbing?
Same as the summer, really. But it's easier to have one with adjustable leg loops. I just use the same harness as I use in the summer. If I'm wanting to go a bit lighter, then I might go for a sort of alpine style harness. But generally, if I'm winter climbing, I might be needing to sit in that harness on a small stance, so I want it to be fairly comfortable. So I'll just use the same harness as I use in the summer.
Awesome. There's a question about going out solo in the in winter as well. I think going out solo is a totally fine thing to do, as long as you've got sort of backup, and you might not be pushing your limits on that day because there's no sort of off. If it's a particularly gnarly day where you know it's going to be quite wild and the avalanche case you can do, just keep it mellow and just go to places where you don't need to put yourself in too much danger, I guess. Do you agree with that, Kath? Or would you add
I agree with that. I go out quite a lot. It's quite nice sometimes going out on a winter's day on your own and just enjoying the peace and quiet of the mountains on a winter's day. But I definitely will be being very selective about what my objectives are, that they're not super gnarly, that it's mellow, and also making sure that I've left some details of what my plan is with someone, and that there's a really defined cut-off time. So if I'm not back, someone starts to do something about it, rather than people thinking, where's she gone? Yeah. So and trying to stick to my plan, really. Yeah, sometimes plans change, And if my plan did change and I had phone signal, then I'll just ping through a text message to say, oh yeah, I haven't gone up here, I've gone up there instead. Just so that those people know where you are and what you're doing.
Amazing. I don't know if can we make the CPD on the D-log thing? D-log.
So
and,
unfortunately, I inquired about this, and because we've allowed anyone to attend, the associations won't allow it to be CPD. However, I'd still put it on your D-log because it shows that you've been putting some time to learning stuff and developing yourself.
Yeah. Perfect. And if you're using goggles, I just like clear goggles, especially in low vis. Clear goggles work best for me. I don't know if you have anything different, Kath, if you're
I quite often use yellow, so I find that I get a bit more definition. So the same sort of goggles as you would buy for skiing in poor visibility work for walking in poor visibility. What you don't want to do is have like a pair of category 4 that are for bright sunlight. You just can't really see anything. So yeah. Clear or yellow tend to work really well for Wales, the lakes, well, for British winter really.
Yeah, or the rose tinted glasses like Jamie's just said. You need a lot of them for Scottish winter, don't you? So that was an amazing day. Yeah, we got pummeled in the face by hail, and yeah. D-log is the digital logbook. So if you're on the part of the mountain training schemes, it's a digital logbook where you log all your experience. And you can use a magnifying glass, like credit card size magnifying glass is fantastic for zooming in on the map as well. What else have we got? Personal locator beacon. Kath, have you got any thoughts on personal locator beacons?
I don't generally tend to carry one. Yeah, I haven't carried one in Scotland, but having said that, if I was going into some remote part on an expedition for a few days, then I think it would be a really sensible thing to take. If you're going into the Fanax or Fisherfield Forest, which is like miles and miles from help, then I don't think there's anything wrong with taking one along, because you can get help if you need it. You know, you can do that. So I think it's quite a sensible thing, and those sort of things are becoming more and more common and more easy to access. So the Garmin InReach is pretty small, a pretty low subscription to it. So yeah, not a bad idea.
Awesome. And there's been a say about sharing the location on WhatsApp. Just be careful of your battery life if you're doing that, I think, in case you need to call for help later on. There's been a couple of requests, Kath, as well, for you to upload the videos to YouTube if you don't mind.
So Jack in marketing will share a link with all of you at the start of next week. So people who are registered can access the webinars, and that's how we've decided to work it.
Cool. And the videos you can you can see on the presentation, I guess.
Yeah.
Perfect. Cool. And then, is there a minimum age for Scotland days? I'm assuming at the Plasma courses, is it 18 or is it
18, I think.
18?
But check with the bookings team; they'll be able to let you know.
If you email that, use that email address there, info@pyb.co.uk, and they'll answer those questions like that. Cool. That seems like a good place to wrap it up, I think. Seems like everything's answered. So if you've got any more questions, then don't hesitate to email info@pyb, and they can be forwarded on to Kath or myself, and we can answer them for you. But other than that, I hope everyone has a fantastic winter and we get lots of snow. Fingers crossed. It's a sign of things to come, this colder weather. And we can get out and enjoy these mountains as well, safely.
Cool. Thanks for coming along, guys, and hope you enjoyed it. And just a little reminder that there's 2 more webinars in the series to come on avalanches. So the first one's about sort of why avalanches happen, how they form, and all of that sort of stuff to do with snow. And then the second one is about planning a day and having a safe time out in the mountains in winter and avoiding avalanches. So it'd be great to see folks back for them. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Right. See you all soon. Mm.